All right. I'm going to say something about inflation and inflation expectations. Because within the libertarian community, there's a lot of smart people I know, and I met a lot of these people in Las Vegas when I was at Freedom Fest. FreedomFest.com, you can look it up last week. And increasingly, I see that people are expecting inflation. And that is based on very solid literature, especially within the Austrian School of Economics. A lot of it is free online. You can find it at the Mises Institute. And me too. I'm an Austrian. I'm definitely someone who follows the Austrian School of Economics. And the Austrian School predicts inflation when you have the kind of situation that we have now. And we also see inflation in the amount of money in the balance sheet of the Fed and all that. But I would like to say something about inflation expectations as inflation is defined today. Because inflation today by the central banks and in general is measured by the Consumer Price Index, the CPI. And when people say that they expect inflation, they expect inflation in the Consumer Price Index. We have to realize that the economy today and the money supply is a totally sort of artificial, abstract thing. It's not based in anything solid anymore. What they are based on is the inflation in the Consumer Price Index. In Europe and in Norway, where I come from, it's very easy because the targeting of inflation on the Consumer Price Index is explicit. In the U.S., you don't have an explicit target. You just have you just have a price stability paradigm and something on low unemployment. In Europe, it's specified specifically in Norway, for example, 2.5% inflation in the Consumer Price Index. And it's important to realize that all the central banks in the world are aligned. They listen to each other, they look at each other, they work on their future models together, they share data. And I've been attending central bank conferences, and to some extent I've gained respect is not the right word, because I still despise the whole system, but I've gotten some sort of respect, or I've seen that there's some credibility to the craft that they're doing, and that is their mandate is 2.5% inflation, and they have all the tools in the world, pretty much, to make sure that happens. Their mandate is 2.5% inflation in the Consumer Price Index, and they have a huge toolbox in order to make sure that happens. They can do unprecedented things. We haven't seen all the things that they can do with the money supply. They can buy assets, sell assets, bail out people, do all kinds of weird arrangements with bonds and derivatives, and they can do anything on the financial markets in order to make sure that their mandate is kept up with 2.5% inflation. So my presumption has become, counter to a lot of the Austrians, that for the foreseeable future, inflation will not take off. The central banks will keep up their mandate of moderate inflation, 2.5% in Norway, 2% within the EU, the ECB, because that is their target and they have the toolbox. So anyone who is saying that they believe that inflation will all of a sudden take off, I would like to engage them and ask them specifically, where do you think that the inflation targeting will give? Will it be the mandate that's given from the politicians that will change? Will it be the market that is forcing inflation on them? Will it be the central banks that independently decide to deviate from it? Or will they change how they interpret their mandate? There's a number of different ways that it could happen, but this is a fairly rigid, as it is, and tight system. So your best bet is to assume that for the foreseeable future that the central banks will be able to keep their inflation mandate and to keep inflation stable in the consumer price index, that is. And another thing that is speaking strongly in my advantage and towards my assumption here and interpretation is the long-term bond yields. I mean, look at the 30-year bond. It is yielding 4%. 4% on the 30-year bond, the U.S. bond. And that tells us that the market is not expecting inflation. I mean, what do you have? A real return on assets, 1-2%, and then you have inflation on top of that and a little bit of risk, and you end up with 4%. That's, you know, that's where it is, and that's where it should be, and that's where we can expect it to be. So the thing is that all the problems that we see in the economy and all the structural problems that needs to be resolved before 30 years have passed. I mean, this cannot go on for 30 years. I don't think any sane person believe that. But there is a chance that they might actually keep inflation stable in the consumer price index, and that it will be something else that has to give. So that inflation will be kept, their mandate will be kept, but something else will go, you know, totally whacked. People are expecting inflation in the consumer price index to be the sort of factor that will take the hit, but I think it might be something else. I don't know what that will be. It's also, I mean, the whole complex is very complex. It's also important to remember, what is the consumer price index? It is a basket of things, and it's also the price in the consumer price index that is measured is the cross point between demand and supply of various kinds of goods. And the governments can also directly start influencing that. Remember that. I mean, you have a demand curve and a supply curve that crosses somewhere, and they can influence the demand curve, or they can influence the supply curve of goods and services and all kinds of stuff. So they can attack this from totally different angles as well. So just keep that in mind. Don't take high inflation coming up for granted. I will see if I can write an article on this, and I'll do something on the Farman website if I do get around to write an article about this subject, because something else might have to give here, and we will need to do some serious thinking on what that might be and how that will play out and how we can speculate on that. And that really is, I think, maybe the major question going forward. How do we speculate on what the governments will do during the next 2 to 5 to 10 or even 30 years for that matter? And the presumptions that we use to do that speculation. Anyway, that was on inflation, and I hope you gained a slightly different perspective on things from that. All right, we're here in wonderful San Francisco. I'm going to give you a little sweep of the city here, just as a little bonus extra. I love this city. It's so beautiful. The Coit Tower over there and the harbor, a little bit foggy today, but it's a beautiful day.